This is going to be a very eagle eye view on immigration policy, and I am not a lawyer, so I do not know the ins and outs of all these laws, but hopefully this gives you an idea of like what does this landscape look like? It's very complicated. There's a lot going on. Hopefully things get a little clearer today. So next slide. So U.S. immigration policy, it is often like considered what is the national interest of the U.S. That is like immigration is in the national interest of the US. And based on that, the US asks a few things like what kind of immigrants do you want to bring into the country? So people who are coming in are being reunified with their families. Do the people coming in contribute to the workforce? Bringing in people from all parts of the world. And so you have diversity based visas. And then people who are fleeing crisis, or which is war, climate disasters, or other kinds of crises. Next slide. Um, and so within immigration pathways, you have like permanent immigration pathways and temporary immigration pathways. Like I said, there's like the diversity immigrant visas to include people from all across the world. You also have employer sponsored work visas. So there's this table right here, which is a lot of different visa types. Not super important right now to look through most of those, except for this fourth preference. You might not be able to read it. Apologies. But this is like a special immigrant visa. And these are people who came in because, or can get a visa because they helped the US, either the State Department, USAID, sometimes the Department of Defense. And if you've heard about these visas, you've probably heard about them with regards to Afghans who helped the US government over the last few decades. And then finally, you have refugees and asylum, and we'll get into that a little bit. But basically, refugees, they go through a very, very long process to come here after fleeing war. Asylum seekers often come through ports of entry, which are either at the border or airports or on the coast, and are intercepted by a border patrol officer, and then will ask for asylum into the US, and then they go through a process to do that. There's also temporary immigration, and I will talk about that on the next slide. So temporary immigration, most of this is pretty self-explanatory, like tourists, students, and diplomats. There are also temporary workers, and that can include everything from people who are coming to work every day in the US. They live in Canada or Mexico, and then they cross the border to do their jobs here in the US. So you see this often in like El Paso or Buffalo, places like that. You also have seasonal workers, like farm workers, people who come in for very specific projects, like the temple workers often do. And then you also even have like H-1B visa holders who are considered temporary workers, although, as we know, a lot of people on H-1B visas, especially in the South Asian community, end up staying here for much longer than their H-1B. Um, there's also these other kind of quasi-immigration statuses. So you have this status called temporary protected status, and that basically means that if you're from a country that is experiencing war or a humanitarian crisis, and you've come here, you might not have the proper documentation to be here, but this TPS status for people from that country, they're here kind of now because they have nowhere else to go. So it can be things like after an earthquake, which is what happened, or after a hurricane and lots of other things happened in Haiti, a series of crises happened. It can be like after a civil war, which is why Cameroonian immigrants often have TPS. And in the case of Nepal or Afghanistan, because of various crises that have happened in both of those countries, for South Asians, those are kind of the two main communities we think of with TPS. And then there are other temporary measures like for victims of human trafficking, or if you have more complicated immigration statuses that I don't completely fully understand. But those are the many um, temporary or quasi-immigration categories. Next slide. And then broadly, there's a few agencies involved. So they all live inside the Department of Homeland Security. You have the USCIS, which, you know, processes visas and helps people with green cards and passports. You have Customs and Border Patrol, who within 100 miles of the border, so that's not just the US Mexico border and the US Canada border, but also along the coasts. They operate within that. And then you have ICE, which does enforcement primarily within the interior of the country, but they also, like, you'll see ICE raids in a place like New York, which is technically within the 100 miles of the US border. So they're often the agency deporting people. Um, and then deportations usually happen because you're not supposed to be in the country. And that is, what undocumented immigration is. So right now, there are about 1.4 million undocumented immigrants who are Asian or come from an Asian country. Indians are the third largest group of undocumented immigrants, not just among Asian Americans, but among all undocumented immigrants. And as of much more recently, like the last few years, a lot of Indians have been intercepted at both the US Mexico and US Canada border. Oftentimes, like when you think about Asian Americans and how they become undocumented, they may like fall out of status or overstay a visa. So this is kind of a newer thing where you see South Asians coming to the border and kind of being intercepted. Um, so that's next slide. So how did we get here? There's a very long history of militarization of the US-Mexico border, including many people who have tried to build walls. Eisenhower tried to deport Mexican immigrants. So this is the US immigration policy has always been racialized. We can go back even further, right, into the 19th century to show this. But the DHS was established in 2001 after 9/11, and ICE was one of those agencies that became part of DHS. Um, and ICE does a lot of things, but deportations, I think, are the most visible thing that they do. That when Obama became president, deportations spiked. So that was the first time in, I think, 50 years that deportations were as high as they were under Obama. And deportations were happening before ICE became a part of the US government, to be clear. But under Obama, they really, really went up. And because of pressure from immigrant rights groups in his second term, Obama started deprioritizing the deportation of non-criminal undocumented immigrants, which doesn't mean that those people weren't being deported. It was just that was less of a priority for ICE, or that's how they were directed. The other two things that immigrant rights groups really pressed Obama on and were able to get were executive orders called DACA and DAPA. And DACA is providing a pathway to citizenship for children who were undocumented and immigrated here as children. And then DAPA, which was struck down right after it was introduced, was supposed to be providing a pathway to citizenship for people who are undocumented, but the parents of children who are US citizens. And the last thing that happened under Obama was a big wave of unaccompanied minors who were then like held, these were minors who were coming through Latin America to the US Mexico border. They were being intercepted there, and then Obama was holding them in these places as they were, or the Obama administration was holding them in places where they would be processed for asylum. Now, that model was then used by the Trump administration. If you remember, under Trump, there was this phrase called kids in cages. And that was basically Border Patrol were separating children from their parents. One part of this was the visual of something so horrific should deter people from getting asylum, but those kids would then be held in these same uh, facilities and then processed separately from their parents, and their parents were often like turned away for asylum. Under Trump, you also had this policy called Remain in Mexico, which was basically um, asylum seekers would apply for asylum in Mexico rather than at the US-Mexico border. And the other part of this is what is called metering, which means that CBP would primarily look at accept immigration or asylum claims at official ports of entry, which means like a border crossing, rather than what you usually are supposed to be able to do, which is anywhere along the US Mexico border. If you are seeking asylum, you can go there, and then, like, if a CBP officer finds you, you can ask for asylum. So this is a huge change in the way asylum is asked for. During the pandemic, Trump used this Title 42, to say that asylum seekers were part of a health emergency, and that was a way to almost completely stop asylum. And then the other thing, again, like deportations were definitely happening under Obama, but resumption of deportations of like against non-criminal undocumented immigrants started up under Trump again. Um, and then under Biden, again, he deprioritized non-criminal deportations. Again, this does not mean that like deportation stopped. It just means they kind of went down. Um, but they were still happening at pretty high levels. What Biden also did was he maintained and expanded restrictions on asylum. He kept Title 42 in place while the pandemic was happening, and remained in Mexico stayed in place even after Biden lifted the health emergency for COVID. Last year, or yeah, last year, I believe, he also introduced additional restrictions on asylum, which basically was an asylum ban, especially for people at the US Mexico border. Next slide. So, all of that under Biden created a pathway for what we have with Trump now, right? So, we have this whole buildup happening. And what Trump does, again, continues a lot of the same policies from before, and then implements a bunch of executive orders in this first month. One of them, this national emergency at the southern border, like this is mostly visual. Asylum has been kind of not accepted, or there's basically a ban on asylum, but now calling it an invasion and an international emergency provides a new kind of political urgency to an issue that I think in a bipartisan way has been really killed, unfortunately. But some of the other executive orders. So there's an executive order to revoke birthright citizenship, which is a violation of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says that if you were born in the US, you are a US citizen. It doesn't matter like what your parents do or what their status is. And so this executive order is very much being challenged. There is an executive order of quote unquote enhanced vetting for national security of visa applicants. This is a resumption of the Muslim ban, by different language than saying, we don't want people from XYZ countries because they are Muslim majority countries. The Trump administration has suspended the refugee assistance program. That means refugees can't come in, and when they are coming in, they're not going to be able to access the resources that are required for resettlement. And then Trump also rescinded a bunch of Biden era executive orders that, for all of Biden's flaws, did actually help immigrants who are coming into the US. So first is undoing the ICE guidelines that Biden had put in place, especially around like the deportation of non-criminals. One of the executive orders was around like reunifying families. Trump dismantled that task force, which means families, many of whom were separated by Trump, are again staying separated. Undoing efforts to help immigrants integrate into American communities. Again, a lot of those are Afghans who fled and are trying to find a new life here in the US. And then dismantling programs to help climate refugees specifically. That's kind of the last of the executive orders from Biden that Trump is undoing. So this is, a lot. Um, that has happened. If you want more information, we're part of this South Asian Policy Working Group, and they have a learning hub on immigration. It's very useful, and it'll be also useful because a lot of what Kalpana will talk about um, around Know Your Rights, those resources are also there too.
Thank you so much, Ria. Sorry, but that was really, really comprehensive, and yeah, you covered a lot of ground in a very short time. And so, yeah, if folks have questions, we'll do Q&A sort of at the end, just so that like if there are folks questions that also both Kalpana and Ria can chime in on, that way they'll have a chance to do so. So do save your questions for the end. I just dropped that link to the Immigration Learning Hub that Ria mentioned in the chat. And we'll be sharing the recording from this as well with folks after the fact, so the link will be there as well. But with that, I will turn it over now to Kalpana. Let me get your slides up, and hopefully I get the right ones this time. Um, are you able to see the slides?
I see them. Hopefully everybody else does too.
Excellent. Okay. Well, then I will go off camera and over to you.
Thanks so much. You can actually just advance the slide if you want to. Great. So I'm Kalpana Pedipotla, and I'm part of a new organization, South Asian American Justice Collaborative, as Pranay mentioned. It's a new organization, but this concept has been, I think, almost not quite a decade in the making. It was in the fall of 2016 in Trump 1.0 that this idea was really started taking shape. And as our first effort, what we did is we funded a legal impact fellow that focuses on South Asian issues at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF. And then subsequently, this idea was met with a lot of urgency and need from a survey that we did, and we decided to go ahead and form. So SAJCO formed in July 2024. We have a couple programs that are launching, and hopefully I can stay in touch with your group to let you know more about them, including we're creating a resource hotline with consultations with immigration attorneys that we hope to launch sometime either in April or May. And we do have a telephone number up on the screen, but please don't call yet because we're not ready. But if in the event that when we start publicizing it, this will be an opportunity for people to speak in real time with immigration lawyers who might be able to help at least troubleshoot on people's cases. So I'm going to start us off on a general Know Your Rights program. If you wanted to go to the next slide, and I just wanted to, and if you can keep going one more slide. Before I jump into it, is it okay if I just look back for a second about something that Ria said, because I don't want it to get missed in this group before we launch into Know Your Rights, and that's around the birthright citizenship executive order. Less discussed in the news, and unless is that this order would apply not just to people who have either entered without inspection or overstayed their visas or otherwise are undocumented, but it includes people who have entered the United States on a visa, including an H-1B visa, for example. And one of the reasons why people remain on H-1B visas for as long as they do, sometimes upwards easily of 10 plus years, relates to the huge green card backlog for people from India. So happy to answer questions about that towards the end. But today, right now, I'm going to jump into this Know Your Rights presentation. And so purpose here is to give you at least some information to know how to arm yourself in the event you or somebody you know or your communities encounter ICE and what your rights may be in different circumstances. So I think I'll just jump into the specifics. This is a more of an overview side. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. I've practiced law for 25 years, but I'm not going to be giving legal advice here because it's more general purpose today. And so just at the end, if you have real specific concerns about your own cases, please speak with an attorney to discuss those. Pranay, why don't we go ahead to the next slide? Okay, So I think this visual is hopefully meaningful for people here, and that is that everyone in the borders of the United States have rights under the Constitution. And this is super important because, as people probably are feeling, is that there's an erosion that's happening in the United States of what our constitutional rights are. And it's so important to realize that it doesn't matter what a person's immigration status is, they all have the rights. Just like I have rights under the Constitution, anybody who's in the United States undocumented also has rights, even if they're just passing through the country on a visitor visa. So what are those rights? Number one, the right to remain silent. The way this right works, though, is it only works if you say that you are exercising your right to remain silent. Now, you don't have to use the exact language I put up here, but you can use something similar to it, though. Like, I wish to remain silent, using my right to remain silent under the Constitution. Whatever you want to say, but you must state that. Remaining silent by itself may not be enough. This is important because you are not obligated to disclose where you were born or how you entered the United States. And as we'll get into some scenarios, but the right to remain silent covers those aspects. You have a right to refuse entry to ICE at your home or in certain private areas, and we'll be talking about what the kinds of documents ICE might try to show to gain entry to your home or other areas. You have a right to refuse signing documents, and this is critical, especially if a document is in yeah, I see Pranay's joke there, but you have the right to refuse signing documents, especially if it's not in a language that you can read. And sometimes that happens. People are only presented with an English document, then asked to sign it. And so I would never recommend signing a document unless you're consulting with an attorney at the time. And you have a right to refuse consent for searches. Again, we'll be talking about the types of warrants that the ICE may or may not have with them. All right, we'll go ahead to the next slide. These basic rights, though, will cover some of the scenarios that we're going to be looking at. If you can advance it to the next slide. This is a big overview slide. I encourage you to spend a little time with it. Main point is there are many different agencies that are that enforce immigration laws or provide immigration benefits. And Ria had explained the difference between ICE and CBP. What you're seeing a lot of in the news right now, though, is ICE, or people wearing other jackets called emergency removal operations, which is within ICE, or so you might see vests that say ERO. These are really the people, though, that they oh, I see a typo. They enforce our immigration laws. They are responsible for the arrests, detentions, and removal from the United States. But there are other departments that also intersect with U.S. immigration. Everything from the Department of Labor to the State Department if somebody's outside of the United States, and the Department of Justice, which oversees our immigration courts. You want to move forward to the next slide. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about, besides what ICE does, the arrests, the raids, the detentions, but how they do it. Their ICE is, they look very tactical in their gear. They look like the police. They look like a bomb squad. They pretend to be the FBI or the police. And right now in the United States, they may be working with police departments. The one thing I want to say is there is pushback on that. There are sanctuary states and cities that limit this cooperation, and people may be like, well, why are they limiting cooperation with ICE? Isn't this something we want? We want people to, who are not supposed to be in the United States, we shouldn't be giving them safe harbor or sanctuary. Well, there's a real reason why our police departments do that. I live in a sanctuary state, and the reason has to do with actually community safety itself. If people are too scared to report crimes because they're afraid that they or a family member or a community member may be deported, then they're less likely to cooperate with the police. So that is why the state where I live made the decision to not cooperate with ICE, typically because of a community safety issue. So kind of the opposite of this notion that cooperation actually leads to greater community safety. And the question is it legal for ICE to present to be FBI? ICE can lie, yes. Law enforcement can lie, and they do lie. So that is it's just being aware that they are not the FBI. They can't wear an FBI vest, but they might make you think that they are part of the FBI or the police. All right. Let's see. The other thing is, so what are some other tactics? They come early in the morning. They want to catch people off guard when they're not, they're very insidiously when they're getting their kids off to school. That's a tactical move, is to come early in the morning. They may be coming looking for one person, but that doesn't stop them from arresting other people who may also present without papers. They may take your cell phone information, and this is something that happens also at our border through CBP, and use information for your phones to determine that somebody has actually violated their status, and then look at opportunities to make an arrest that way. And then, yeah, they don't show up in police cars. They're typically going to come in unmarked cars. You're not going to know they're an ICE agent until they usually get out of their cars. All right, so we can go to the next slide. All right, so who is at risk? So Ria was talking about a little bit about visa overstays. That has typically been the way that people coming from South Asia, specifically India, have become undocumented, is that they typically entered the United States with a visa, valid visa, but they may have either stayed past their allowed time, or there's other reasons why an overstay occurs. And people may be trying to regularize their status, but that if they're in that in-between place where something's happened on their visa and they're not currently in status, they may be at risk for removal. They may be people who have entered without papers, or we call it IWI in immigration, or entered without inspection. Those are folks that are coming typically at the southern or northern borders. And I think Rhea mentioned that there's been an increase in the number of immigrants coming from South Asian countries. In 2023, from 2022 to 2023, the number of immigrants coming to the southern border from India increased fivefold. So they went from approximately 20,000 people showing up to almost 100,000 apprehensions at the southern border for people from India. There may be people who have other prior removal orders or certain criminal convictions. And I just wanted to note here, in brief, because it's a complicated act, is the Lake and Riley Act that was recently passed. That act was, I think, ill-conceived in terms of what the goal was, which was this notion that we would keep ourselves safer if we criminalized everybody for small crimes and deported them. And that act is so far-reaching. It includes people who just may have made an admission that they, and it doesn't state where the admission occurred. Like, you could have told a friend that I shoplifted that candy bar at the store, or you could be just arrested, which means you have not actually been found guilty and potentially be subject to removal under this act. And this is a complicated act, so we won't probably be able to touch upon it too much here. And then other people that are at risk is people who can experience expedited removal. And this typically used to happen just at our border, but under the administration now, we have removed that requirement, and people can be placed into expedited removal anywhere in the United States if they cannot prove that they have 2 years of continuous U.S. residence. And I know that my remarks are supposed to be more on know your rights, but this includes people, for example, whose immigration papers have been withheld from them, if let's say they have an abusive spouse, I do a lot of work. My career was spent largely in the space of domestic intersection between domestic violence and immigration. And the number one tactic is for an abuser to withhold, to keep documents of the person that of their spouse. And that individual, this is creating a lot of alarm in the DV community, because how do people show that they have 2 years of continuous US residence if they do not have access to their documents? So that's who's at risk. And now we'll talk about what some of the areas in which this occurs. We can go there. So first, if ICE comes, so it, just like in interactions with the police as well, some of your greatest protections will be in your home. Okay, so if ICE comes to your home, the immigration advocacy community is typically advising not to open the door, because if you open the door, then you have opened the opportunity for ICE to enter your house. ICE will take that, even if you don't invite them in the house, they will take the fact that you've opened their door as permission to enter your home. Okay, so do not open the door if you're worried about your immigration status or a member of your family's immigration status, or whoever else lives in that house. If ICE knocks, you are not required to answer or say that you are home. You do not have to say, it's not rude to not answer, and it's not rude to not say that you're home. You have no obligation. And if they come there, sometimes they'll say, well, you need to let us in because we have a warrant. And they'll flash a document saying we've got a warrant. And you have to be very careful here, because unless it is a judicial warrant signed by a judge, they typically do not have a basis to enter your home. And so we're going to look at a document in the next slide of what that looks like, but you should ask them to hold it up to a window or slide it under the door before you admit them to the house. And if they do not have a warrant, you say, I'm sorry, I don't consent to your entry, please leave. Okay. And there's some resources I placed at the end of several organizations that have Know Your Rights cards. And if you want you can get one of those cards and then keep it in your home and then just slip it under the door. Okay. All right, so let's go over this. So this is an actual ICE warrant, which is an immigration warrant. It is not sufficient for ICE to enter your home. So what are you looking for? You're looking for, it's got the words Department of Homeland Security up at the top. It sure seems scary because it's got warrant for arrest of alien, but that does not give somebody permission to enter your house. It's not a search warrant. Okay. The other thing is make sure the name on there is actually the name of the right individual, because they often don't. They do things like they'll put their thumb over it, they'll cover up the name. They'll show it so quickly you can't see the name. They don't know that you're supposed to look at your name. So they'll present a document that might have been for somebody else, which has nothing to do with you. But again, if you see this is not a judicial warrant, and they cannot enter your home with this document. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Now this is a court order. And at the moment, and for decades that I've practiced immigration law for 20 plus years, they don't typically get these because it takes a lot of effort to go into a U.S. district court and to go after a specific person to get a search and seizure warrant to enter somebody's house. So the 99.99% of these warrants are not going to be this court order. And then if they do have one, they they may present something that doesn't have the actual person's name on it. Typically, this is at an appendix. So you need them to show you the appendix before you, if they show you this document, make sure that your name is the name on the appendix. And this has to be signed, okay? So just like I was able to download this from the internet, they can download it as well. If it is not got all that information in there that has to be there, then it is not sufficient to gain access to a person's home. All right. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay. So when we step out of the house, we start to get a little bit less protections, but you still have more protections if you're in your car. They don't need a warrant to stop the car, but they do need either your consent or a warrant to search it. Okay. And only the driver is required to show an ID. And then these are some basic safety questions: is keep your hands visible. And you can also say, I do not wish to answer any questions. Do not lie or present false documents. Now, this one kind of concerns me, along with other things, is that, and part of what this conversation is all about is asserting one's rights. Recently, I learned that somebody, that a student, a student in the U.S., an international student, was stopped at a stop sign and or ran a stop sign, and he got pulled over, and he immediately volunteered his immigration status. Okay, so it may seem very small, but to me, it bugged me just a little bit, because if we just start volunteering everything because we're scared, we are just continuing to diminish our rights in the United States. So I just would encourage people to, to stay calm, remember what your rights are, because you have several, and do not be intimidated by ICE. They are intimidating. I have met many of them, but do not be intimidated by them. It's very, very important to assert your rights, even in situations when you've been pulled over in the car. Okay, we'll go to another slide. When you get to the workplace, again, we're kind of going more orders of less protections. ICE can enter the public areas of a workplace. They can come into the reception area, etc., but they need a warrant or the employer's permission to enter the private areas. Now, what we see happening is a lot of employers are scared to not comply. And so unfortunately, the anticipation is the average employer is going to allow ICE agents to come into the private areas of their businesses. There's a do not run, right? I guess I'm not so worried about the additional charges. This is a complicated thing. One of my board members have informed me that what she's seeing is that a lot of people are running, because the other downside of it is that they might then be picked up for expedited removal. But ICE is they are armed, and you should, in my opinion, you need to be safe. Yes, now they can enter schools and universities, all what we call sensitive spaces. They are no longer ICE is no longer barred from entering those areas. That was done by memo historically, and that memo has been taken away. Okay, if you in the workplace, don't assume that you have to answer questions. Ask them, if you are being detained, am I free to leave? Because they might just come in there and just start asking a bunch of questions, and then you can just ask them, am I free to leave? So the same thing applies here. And if they want to ask questions, then you can also still exercise your right to remain silent. Okay, so then we're going to get to the next area, which is outside. ICE does not need a warrant to approach you, but does need one to detain or search you. Okay, so again, like in the workplace, you and this is a concern because there's opportunities for more racial profiling to happen the way that immigration enforcement is now taking place. The reason why the Obama administration, the Biden administration, had these priorities for whom they would deport had much to do with number one, first they wanted to focus on more dangerous individuals in the United States who had committed crimes, more serious crimes than just being accused of crime, but serious crimes. And so they focused on those in order to also limit the amount of resources, but also to not be accused of racial profiling. And right now, there is, now that priorities have been removed as a policy, there is the way that ICE would have to enforce the laws and achieve these goals of large deportations would be to, in my opinion, to approach people through racial profiling. So it's important to, ask if you're being detained. If not, walk away. But again, do not lie or present false documents. If you are in the United States and you have either overstayed your visa or you've entered without inspection, but you have a case that's going on, that is something that's very important to have access to those kinds of documents and that information and the lawyer that's representing you. Because what ICE does is if they cannot come to your home, they wait till you leave your house. And then they try to pick you up in a public space. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I think you've been hearing this refrain, and it's because we do want people to assert their rights. I think people maybe on this call may have heard about the ICE director in Chicago lamenting about so many people now doing these know your rights things that they're now interfering with their ability to do their work, which is, asserting one's rights doesn't impact ICE's ability to do its work. It just means that you're not making ICE's job just so easy to them that they can get around people's rights. So I think it's super important to know these rights and assert them. So some of the ideas here that I won't repeat them again, but carry an attorney's number with you. Even if you haven't retained that lawyer, have the number of an attorney. One of my other colleagues have been saying since that because ICE is doing these raids at odd hours, like in the workplaces, that they suggest not necessarily having the attorney's number only, but like a trusted friend that can call an attorney on your behalf. Another thing that we're seeing and there's worries about is typically you should be able to get a phone call. ICE is supposed to give you access within 72 hours. On the resource page, I included the PDF to ICE's own policies for allowing somebody to have a phone call. But we do know that they are trying to process people within a shorter period of time for expedited removal opportunities. And that sometimes results in not getting that phone call within the time period that somebody's held because they're being moved out too quickly. We do not recommend signing anything without legal advice. And then there's also, you should make a plan if you have any health conditions, inform them so that because that is one way I've gotten people out of ICE detention because of the health information that we were able to provide. And then also it's very important for you to make plans for your children. The one telephone that they are supposed to allow you to make is to contact your consulate. If you are seeking asylum from a country, though, by contacting your consulate, you are giving up your claim for asylum potentially because you're claiming your country can protect you by through that phone call. Asking for a bond to be released from detention. I want to be honest, the bonds are currently being heavily denied. And if you have a fear of returning to your home country, tell the officer, because then they are required to turn that into a credible fear interview to see if you might qualify for asylum. All right, that's a lot. On the right-hand side is a link to a locator where you can try to find where somebody has been detained. And this is important for because maybe you have a friend or a family member. I just want to say that unfortunately they are not updating this, and it has become a bit harder to locate people through this system. All right, and we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so I think these are my final key takeaways. I think I've covered all of them except for the safety plan and the last bullet point. So the safety plan in Indo-American Center in Chicago. They are a partner of Sajco's, and they created a really nice emergency plan that we included as a link in the resources. Another important thing is to get the name and badge information of officers, especially if you believe you've been mistreated. And that is another way to potentially apply pressure and potentially create opportunities to bring that out for being released on a bond. I think we can go to the next slide, and I think maybe I'll just turn the slide presentation off. Okay, these are our resources. There's a lot of great Know Your Rights programs out, materials out there, much greater than what we've created. People who have done this for a long time. All of these are really wonderful. I just want to say National Immigration Law Center, National Immigrant Justice Center, and ACLU have been at the forefront of fighting for immigrant rights throughout the country nationally. And they have some great materials, as do all the other organizations here. And I think that's it. And I just wanted to, yeah, okay. If you can close the program there for a minute. I think I covered most of my points. I just wanted to say this. It is probably the hardest thing to do is to assert your rights in front of an ICE agent who is dressed in tactical gear. These are sometimes really large people. And we are in a very different place than we've ever been in this country. But I just highly recommend safely assert your rights, because if you do not, then we will keep having them eroded.